Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Self-Improvement Saturday. My name is Daniel Midson-Short. This is episode 6 of Self-Improvement Saturday. We are live on YouTube and we are live on Instagram. For those of you who might be following on either of those platforms, it's great to have you here. Or if you're watching this later, hello to you later as well. This is episode 6 of Self-Improvement Saturday. Today is August 5th, 2023. And for those who are on Instagram, the earlier episodes were on YouTube. And just last week, I decided on a whim to add an episode to Instagram. So hello to those of you who are joining us there. And hello to those of you on YouTube as well. Today, we are going to do a deep dive on an interesting topic. The topic of negative emotions. And you might think, well, if this show is called Self-Improvement Saturday, why are we talking about negative emotions? What's the value of actually dwelling on something negative or that's something that's going to hold us back in some way? And that's a valid question. It's actually something that I think in my life I have avoided thinking about is the negative emotions that I might experience personally or that other people have kind of thrust onto me over the years. And I haven't really explored how they, first of all, have held me back, but potentially how they might have moved me forward as well in my life. And so that's what I want to talk about in this episode today. We're probably going to go for around 30 minutes or so, depending on how deep I dive into these different emotions. Before I get started, I want to give credit to 2 books that have been really impacting me lately. I mentioned this one the other week, which is by David Hawkins, Dr. David Hawkins, The Map of Consciousness Revealed or Explained, Map of Consciousness Explained. It is a heavy book. It definitely delves into more of the spiritual kind of realm of development, something that I frankly haven't really explored up until recently. But it's definitely, if you're a person who is seeking some meaning and purpose beyond just the everyday existence of life, definitely check out this book. It's got some very profound ideas and it really explains how we grow and develop as people. Leading on from this book is another book by David Hawkins, which kind of inspired today's episode and will inspire next week's episode as well, which I'll explain at the end, is the book Letting Go. And this book is more about how our emotions and our conscious states impact us, how we actually are held back by them if we're not aware of them, and how by letting go of them and actually surrendering to them in a way, that's what he talks about in this book, how you can profoundly change yourself and the world that you exist in. So I really want to give a shout out to these 2 books, Map of Consciousness Explained and Letting Go. By far the 2 best books I've ever read that explain emotions and inner development in definitely a woo-woo way, but not in a way that is overwhelming or weird. So check them out if you're interested in either. I'm definitely going to be crediting this one today for a lot of the ideas and the understanding that I've been having around negative emotions. So hopefully there's some people out there who want to read these books, and I'd love to discuss them with you at some stage. As always, I have all my notes here that I'll be using as we talk through this topic, and hopefully this will be insightful for you. So let's talk about negative emotions. Negative emotions are an interesting thing because very often in our lives, we tend to avoid them. We act like they don't affect us, or we try to bury them, suppress them in our lives because we think that experiencing them or giving into them in some way is going to actually damage us, is going to make us worse as a person. And in some respects, that's true if we let them completely take over who we are. But at the same time, they actually help us to evolve, to develop, to keep progressing and actualizing if we're willing to explore them and go into them in a little bit more depth. So I know for some people, this topic might be a bit out there and it's not your typical self-improvement topic, but bear with me because I think there's a lot of value if you really explore these for yourselves. And all I would ask is, if you're watching this, if you're here with me right now, just be open to what I'm saying. Don't necessarily have to take it on for yourself. See how you feel, but just be open to it because there's a lot of value in here. There are actually 6 different negative emotions that we're going to talk through today. And again, I want to credit Letting Go. This is where a lot of them have been coming from, and they're actually in the sequence that he explains in the book David Hawkins goes through. So if you get a chance, definitely read that book. It will have a lot more depth. But this is my understanding, my kind of level of perception around these emotions right now. I want to also mention a metaphor that has been very useful for me over the years. I learned a long time ago around the idea of negative emotions and why they impact us if we ignore them. If you have ever had a pebble or a rock in your shoe when you're walking along, you've probably had that experience before in your life. They are very similar to what negative emotions are like. We all have had that experience. We're walking along and we feel something in our shoe and we think, oh, what is that? And we walk a few more steps and we think, well, I probably should do something about it. I'll walk a few more steps. And then it starts to get irritating and it gets worse. And then after a couple of minutes or however long, you think, damn it, and you stop. You take your shoe off and you empty out your shoe and the pebble rock comes out. And then you put your shoe back on and, oh, thank goodness. And then you keep walking. That is very similar to what happens with negative emotions. We experience them, a little nagging feeling, and then we kind of just keep walking with them. We just keep them going in our lives and we ignore them for a little bit. And we say, oh, it's fine, it's fine. And then eventually they get to a point where they start to, they wear on us. They annoy us in some way. They drag us down. They make us depleted. And then eventually we have to stop, acknowledge them, empty ourselves out, if you like, and then we can actually move on from them. So I wanted to share that metaphor as a way to think about negative emotions, that they come into our lives, kind of like a rock gets in a shoe, and then it's up to us what we do with it. We can keep walking along with that rock in our shoe if we want for as long as we want, but you can imagine eventually you're going to get a sore foot and then you're going to start walking funny. You'll probably hurt your back. You're going to be irritated. You're not going to enjoy yourself. So it's really up to you how long you want to carry those negative emotions, but they are very much like that pebble in the shoe that we choose to keep them with us much longer than we need to. All right, so that's a great metaphor to start with. Now I want to talk about the 6 different negative emotions that pop up in our lives and how they can profoundly impact us both negatively and positively if we're aware of them. And I'm going to start at the lowest level, which David Hawkins talks about in his book, Letting Go. The lowest level emotion is apathy. And apathy is probably, we've all felt it at some stage in our lives, is the most destructive emotion that we can have, because it's essentially the feeling of hopelessness or despair, or a feeling like we don't have any control or power in our lives anymore. And a person who is chronically depressed will very often feel a sense of apathy. I know at certain stages in my life where I've struggled with depression, I've definitely felt that apathy. That feeling of there's nothing I can do. I'm just stuck in this situation. There's no hope. And it's a very, very tough emotion to overcome. It's the most powerless emotion that there is. And for people who are in apathy, very often it's being triggered by emotions that are above it, whether it's anger or grief or shame or all those type of things. But very often, if we get to the stage of apathy, we really need support and kindness and love from other people. There's not a lot that we can do for ourselves if we're feeling that. One of the challenges with apathy is that it's very hard to recognize in ourselves because we just feel completely empty. In a way, we feel kind of defeated. And so there's no activity, there's no kind of self-awareness that's coming up. And we get into this kind of routine of just feeling like this is just what life is like, instead of realizing that actually this is what I am like. This is my apathetic state that has been growing over many, many years. Or maybe not growing, maybe shrinking down is a better description. We get smaller in ourselves, and that apathy starts to take over. And we think that's how the world is. It starts to sort of damage our worldview. So apathy is a very difficult thing to, first of all, self-diagnose, but you've probably seen it in other people a lot, people who sort of have given up in a sense in life, or are just very pessimistic, very depressed. And it is a very tough emotion. It's something that we have to acknowledge that happens at times. I know for myself during the COVID lockdown era, that was an incredibly tough time for me because I was very isolated. I couldn't see family. I couldn't see friends. I couldn't speak. And so those things that give me a lot of joy were completely gone. And I fell into apathy and depression for a while, and I got into self-destructive behaviors like a lot of people do. And I felt like the world was shutting down on me. I felt hopeless and powerless. And it took me a long time and a lot of different emotions above that to get through to the point where I feel much more empowered today and in a great place in my life. So I want to say that apathy is real. It's something that we have to recognize. There are ways out of it, but the first step is just to have consciousness around it. So if you're feeling apathetic, First of all, acknowledge it, realize it's there, and realize that it's your model of the world that's been shaped probably by a lot of negative experiences, which weren't your fault, but you're living in them now. So that's the first emotion, is apathy. A very tough one to talk about, but a very real one that we all deal with at some stage. Above apathy is grief. And grief is very often, it's associated with the idea of losing a loved one. But actually, there's different types of grief. And again, I want to acknowledge the book, I'll keep talking about it, Letting Go by David Hawkins. He really changed my understanding of what grief is. It is very much about being attached to the past, whether it's a relationship that you had, it's a lifestyle that you had, it's something that you think you should have done or should have had or whatever. It's your attachment to a past reality or a past environment or situation or relationship that causes the grief. When we try to hold on to what was that isn't anymore, we actually go into a state of grief, which is very hard to understand when we're in it, but it actually is what's causing it a lot of the time. If you think about someone you've loved very much who has passed away, or maybe it was a relationship that broke down and you don't see that person anymore, you can tune into that feeling of grief because of the attachment that you had to that relationship. And so if you can tune into that and feel it for what it is, that it's you actually attaching to it, that changes it, because the attachment comes from a desire to have love or to be involved in that past experience again, to be connected to that person, which is a very natural feeling that we all have. The problem with grief is that a lot of the time we suppress it because we feel foolish or we feel shame or embarrassment about the fact that we are in grief. So if a relationship ends, we feel, oh, I really wish I was still with that person, but now I kind of feel embarrassed or pathetic because I'm the one seeking them and they're not seeking me, or whatever it is. And so you have to realize that you're actually grieving the relationship or the past experience. For me personally, this has been a big one where I grieve past decisions or past successes or things that used to be. So if I had a period of my business where it was really successful or going really well, or I felt like I was on fire in my life, and that time passes, that time's gone, I kind of grieve it because I think, oh, I wish I still had it in a way, but I've moved on from it. I've evolved in some way. And so you can actually grieve circumstances and past situations as much as you grieve relationships, whether the person has passed on or you've broken up or whatever it is. So just having that awareness that the attachment is what creates the grief, that's all you need to do. You don't need to feel embarrassed about the fact you're attached to the past. You don't need to get over it. You just need to be aware of it and say, okay, I'm experiencing this grief for what was. And once you do that, it starts to move it out of your body. Interestingly, as I read in Letting Go, David Hawkins said that if you let yourself actively grieve for about 10 to 20 minutes at a time, you actually just let the emotion come out, it will start to pass. But if you suppress it, you can keep that emotion for years. And we all know people, maybe we are that person who has grieved over something or is not grieved over something and is holding it in. And all it would take is just going through that emotion for 10 to 20 minutes at a time, and it will start to move on. So grief is another very tough negative emotion, and one that is a big part of our society. You see this a lot with people who say, things aren't as good as they used to be. In the good old days, life was like this. They're actually grieving the past. They're actually attached to the past. And that's what it is that they're holding on to. If they just grieved for it and said, man, that was a really good time and I'm sad that it's gone, they'd probably move on from it. And they'd realize that there's a lot of happiness and fulfillment in the current world we live in too. Grief is real. It's something that we all have to experience in our own way. And the more you acknowledge it and sit in it, the better you will start to move past it. The third emotion is fear. And I actually did a Self-Improvement Saturday episode on this a couple of weeks ago about overcoming our fears of failure and how it can affect us in our lives. And I will do a deep dive about this in the future. The emotion of fear is such a big part of our society, and there's so much anxiety in the world today. I went to the bookstore the other day. I was looking at different self-development psychology books. The section on anxiety is massive. It's about 2 or 3 shelves now because we all have so much fear and hesitation and sort of a sense of self-protection that is needed in the world today, a lot of it is just our perception of how things are more dangerous or aren't like they used to be or whatever that's causing that fear. Very often, fear, as we all kind of can tune into, is a self-protection mechanism. It's driven by our ego, which wants to survive. And it's something where we think if there's a threat to ourselves physically or emotionally or financially or whatever, we will resist. We'll try and avoid it. We'll try and get away from it, the fight or the flight. That's the natural thing. I've talked a lot about in the past the idea of overcoming the fear of public speaking. A lot of the time when people start trying to overcome their fear of public speaking, it's an irrational fear. They can't logic their way out of it by just saying, "Oh, I'm fine now." You have to actually stand up, face the fear many times until your body realizes, "I'm not going to die. I'm okay. I'll get through this." And that fear starts to go away because the perceived threat is gone. If you grew up in an environment which was unstable, or people were very critical or negative, or they had conditional love, then very often you will have a lot of fear or a lot of hesitation to step out of a comfort zone. Once you create a safety level in your life, you will actually sit in that for a long time because the fear is stopping you from moving forward. And if you've experienced that, you know exactly what I mean. Fear is something that limits us from growing as people. It limits us from experiencing the world fully. So it is an emotion that we're all very aware of and we've all experienced in our lives a lot. And there's a ton of great books out there, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, The Gift of Fear, there's a lot of psychology books around fear. But the most important thing is to be in the fear and still act anyway. Whatever it is you're fearing, just say, you know what, this is natural, this is normal. I'm trying to protect myself, but I'm actually able to just move on from this by acting through it. It's the best way to do it. So that's fear. The next emotion, the next negative emotion, which is very interesting, is desire. And this one, when I first read it in the books by David Hawkins, I resisted it because I am a desire junkie. I'm a person who needs to have goals and ambitions and something I'm working towards, something I need to do or to be or to have. And I've mentioned just recently, I started reading a lot of books about prosperity and abundance and the law of attraction, which I resisted for a long time. But this concept actually rings true with that as well, that very often, if we desire something too strongly, we're attaching to it, or we think that our value is tied to our desire, whether it's success or prestige or whatever, we actually unattract it, we disattract it. I don't know, repel is probably a better word. We repel the thing from us because we need it. And you've all experienced this in your own life where you know someone who really needs something, they're needy, and you can feel it. You're like, ugh, it's not a nice feeling when someone's very needy or is trying to get something from you because they have a desire. I always use the example of if you go to the shopping mall and there's those people that have the surveys and they're trying to get you to, fill out the survey. You can see they need you to do it. And you're like, oh, get away. That is desire in a way, in a very simple way. But that's what we all do in our lives is we spend a lot of our time desiring, coveting, hoping to get something or be something or do something, when in reality, it's only just going to give us a feeling of fulfillment, a feeling of self-respect, feeling of love. But we think that if we only get that thing, then we'll be okay. And that is the trap, is the desire is actually a negative emotion. So you might be asking, well, if I'm not supposed to desire anything, what the hell do I do, Daniel? Or do I just not care about anything? You can have intentions in your life. You can have things that you would like to experience, that you are working towards as a person, especially through a sense of love and appreciation and gratitude and self-growth. But the idea of desiring it and having to have it, that's the negative side of that. So this is a tough one to understand, and I'm still processing it, having read this book recently, where I still fall into desire a lot. And you have to find your own way through this one, but you'll realize when you're starting to need to get, that's when you know, okay, I'm starting to desire. This is actually a negative emotion. You pull back, and ironically, things come to you a lot easier when you just have a strong intention. You're happy about who you are first. Life flows to you a lot more, and the desire starts to dissipate and makes you feel better about yourself. So that's desire. The fourth negative emotion is anger. And hand on heart, this has been one of my biggest weaknesses in life as being an angry person. Anger is a useful device for a lot of people, especially men. Men fall into the trap of anger as a very normal emotion because actually men are allowed to express anger. We see it in movies where they're allowed to be violent or abusive or whatever, especially to other men. It's okay because it's our way to express emotion. In the society in the world that I grew up in, the only way that you could express yourself as a young boy and a man without getting ridiculed for it was to be angry. That was it. If you cried or you got upset or you were scared, that was unacceptable. But if you were angry, it was actually okay. And so we all kind of lean into that. And I'm not saying women don't as well. Absolutely, you do, but it's more acceptable for women and the female gender to actually be expressive with tears or fear or other emotions as well. But for men, anger especially is one that we hold on to. The reason anger is so destructive is because it actually helps us to be motivated. It helps us to push ourselves in a lot of ways. I have definitely leaned into my anger at times to fuel my ambitions and my work ethic and to try and push through in the world. And when I've done that, it's always had a destructive result. I've never actually achieved anything worthwhile by being angry as a person. Ironically, I think it's going to help me, but it actually hurts me. And so, if you as a person fall into the trap of thinking, if I'm just angry about this, it's going to motivate me, logically and on one level, absolutely it will. But it actually becomes destructive because you're doing it from the wrong space. You're doing it from a negative position versus a positive, constructive position. So if you are an angry person, you feel righteous, you feel bitter, you feel resentful, you feel envious, whatever, however you describe it for yourself, there's a lot of different dimensions of it. Acknowledge the anger, acknowledge how it helps you in some ways, and then say, is this the most constructive way that I can actually get what I want, that I can be a good person? You'll probably find that no, it's not. And again, there's a lot of great books out there. The Dance of Anger is an excellent one. There's a lot of psychology and self-help books about this topic. If you struggle with anger or you use anger to get your way, I would recommend really thinking about it in depth and trying to find ways to move on from it. So that is anger. The sixth emotion is pride. And that's an unconscious laugh of acknowledgement right there because I definitely fall into the trap of being prideful at times in my life. Pride is very driven by ego, where we think that we're right, that we know better, that we have the answer, that we're secretly different from everyone else. Every human being on earth thinks that they're unique. They think that they're the one who is different to everyone else. If you think about it, you live your life. It's a movie where you're the main character and everyone else is kind of a co-star or whatever you want to say. And that's normal. That's how we live. That's our ego experience of the world. But that also generates pride. That creates this sense of, hey, things revolve around me and how I think and how I live. And it creates this dangerous trap where we have to protect that image, that way of being. And you see this a lot, obviously, in people who are successful. If they reach a certain level of success and esteem and value in the world, that they kind of buy into that and they start to become prideful. And you've probably heard that saying, pride comes before the fall. It's very often because we start treating people poorly or we're not doing things out of love. We're actually doing them out of fear or self-protectiveness or attachment or maybe anger or desire or whatever, which is creating pride. The most difficult type of pride is the one that's unconscious, where you're unwilling to listen to other people, even though they're probably going to help you because you think you already know the answer. I've definitely experienced this in my speaking abilities, in different relationships, things like that, where you won't listen because you think you know better and because you're protecting this version of who you are. There's a fear that if you let go of it, maybe you won't be as respected or as loved or whatever. So you hold on to the answers and that you think you already have, and that pride kind of protects you in a way. So pride is definitely something that is in the world today. The challenge here, I think, is that sometimes we mistake what we think is self-esteem is actually pride. And there is a difference to it. You have to feel it for yourself. Self-esteem comes from a sense of being the right person, of having a sense of self-love, a sense of connection to others and your own intrinsic value. Pride is very much about being right, being recognized, being successful, being one up on people. And you can kind of tell the difference there. You know if someone's got strong self esteem or if they've got a strong sense of pride. And my friends, I've had both. So I can definitely tell you which one's better is to try and work on your self esteem versus sitting in your own pride. So there we go. Those are the 6 emotions that we deal with: apathy, grief, fear, desire, anger, and pride. A couple more things that I want to share here about this topic. And one of them is this concept of emotional wrapping. And this is something that I learned years and years ago when I was first doing my coaching training, when I was doing business coaching training. Emotional wrapping is a very interesting thing that we all do without being aware of it. So here's a good example. Let's say that you feel fear about something. I don't know, you're nervous to, maybe you have social anxiety. That's a good example. You're nervous to go out and meet people. You're going to a party and oh man, what's everyone going to think of me? So you're a little bit you're in fear. You're in self-protective mode. Then on top of that emotion of fear, you start to experience shame, or you start to experience helplessness, or you start to experience anger at yourself. You actually wrap one emotion around another emotion. So on the core, you feel fear. Then you start to feel shame. Then you start to feel angry that you still feel shame and fear. And then you might start to feel depressed on top of that. And so all these emotions wrap around each other and they start to form this kind of tight ball of emotion that you can't get past in your life. And you can't dig down to the root cause anymore because you're so wrapped up in these emotions. These don't just happen in the moment, they can happen for years and years and years in our life. I know for me, when I would get very angry in the past, I would then feel very ashamed by the fact I was angry, or I'd feel guilty that I was angry as well. And sometimes that would then spin me into feeling apathetic or depressed. And it all started from this provoked anger state that I had, because I was wrapping the emotions around each other. So for you, I'm sure the same thing happens where you get into a negative loop with one emotion, and then you wrap another emotion around it, and then maybe another emotion. There could be 3 or 4 or 5 or 15 layers, depending on the person and how long you've been doing it. But what you have to do is unfurl them. And the only way to do that is to have awareness. And this is kind of the final point of what I have for today is when you are experiencing negative emotions, the only way to actually let them go is to surrender to them and to be aware of them. And this is tough to do because we don't want to face our negative emotions. We don't want to think that we're a negative person. There's a lot of societal kind of, I don't know, disapproval, if you want to say, of negative emotions. We don't want to be fearful or shameful or angry or prideful or whatever it is. Because it's not the way to be. We're supposed to be positive and happy and everything's fine, right? So actually experiencing negative emotions and saying, I am scared, I am angry, I am apathetic, I am depressed, acknowledging those and being truthful, even just with yourself and sitting in that emotion, you'll start to feel it emanating in you. If you have a sense of anger, is a good example, and you're angry at someone or a situation, just sit in it. Just be angry. Just be angry for 5, 10, 15 minutes. Don't judge it. Don't try and change it. Just be angry. And you will find that it will start to dissipate. A great metaphor for this is a wave in the ocean. If you've ever gone and sat on the beach, you'll probably notice that waves tend to swell. They get to a really high point and then they drop. And that seems to be the motion. So up and then down. And you'll see that a lot in your own emotions as well. They will start to rise, rise, rise. They'll get to a peak and then they'll drop away. If you let yourself experience and you have awareness of an emotion, it will go through a wave and then it will disappear. But if you try and suppress it, it's almost like if you've ever gone into the ocean and stood and tried to force against a wave. If you tried to say, no, I'm not going to let this wave push me, it makes you crash. And that's exactly what happens when we suppress or we repress our feelings, is that eventually we crash. Whenever you have an emotion, whether it's a single emotion or it's one that's wrapped around other emotions, just sit with it, write about it, talk to someone about it if you can, or just talk to yourself. It just be in the awareness of what it is, and you will start to find that it fades over time. The more you tune into your negative emotions, the more you're able to overcome them, the better you will feel as a person. And it will completely open you up to positive emotions, which is what we're going to talk about in next week's episode of Self Improvement Saturday. So, my friends, I hope that these ideas have been interesting and useful for you. I know that's a quite deep thing for a Saturday morning to get into. Again, I truly want to acknowledge David Hawkins in this book, Letting Go. If you get a chance, check it out. Definitely has helped me break through and have a great understanding of myself and where I trap myself with negative emotions. He also goes into the positive emotions and how we can evolve as a person once we've moved through the negative emotions. And so I would really recommend checking that out, sitting with your negative emotions, acknowledging them, and seeing how you can become a better person as a result. So that is everything for this week. I appreciate all of you who have tuned in here. I appreciate everyone who's subscribed on YouTube. Thank you for being part of our community. Thank you to those who have joined on Instagram. It's amazing to have a bunch of people here as well from there. So I hope these ideas have been insightful for you. I look forward to being back next week for Self Improvement Saturday, 9 a.m. California time. Episode number 7 we'll be up to, and we're going to talk about the power of positive emotions. So until then, thanks for watching. And as I always say, thank you for improving yourself.